staying strong and positive for ourselves and our children. We're now streaming live on YouTube, and this is being recorded and will be available on our website as well as on YouTube. And this is, again, Be Strong Families, and we're here with staying strong and positive for ourselves and our children. As you're coming into the space, the virtual space, it would be fabulous if you would open the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen. Mostly everybody is probably familiar with that by now with all the Zooming we've been doing for the past year. But if you open that chat, and then this is really important, click the second thing in the drop-down menu. For me, it says panelists and attendees. And for you, it might say everyone. This is really important because the first drop-down says panelists only or panelists. And what happens is we use the chat a lot for interactivity in this webinar series. And if you just do panelists, especially with this intense topic of grief, I'm not going to read I'm going to assume it's private, and I'm not going to read what you write to the rest of the group. So I need you to put panelists and attendees like Tammy did. Hi, Tammy. And Lawan, good afternoon. Lawan, you're here early today. And Myra, good morning, Myra from Oakdale, California. And Dorothy, I forgot you, I didn't get you. Hi, Dorothy from North Carolina. And Juliana is from Halifax, Canada. Welcome, Juliana. Andrew is our tech support guy and overall great person in Minnesota. And Sandra, welcome back, Sandra. And welcome, April. April, you're doing it to panelists only. So, and Gladys, you're also doing it to panelists only. I'm giving you the opportunity to correct that so that we can all know. And Esmeralda, April, Gladys, be sure to go down to the bottom and press the second option, which is panelists and attendees, because everybody wants to know what you have to say. And hi, Katie, another person from Halifax. I think you did some, Henriette. I think you did some, somebody from Halifax did some promotion. But be sure, again, I'm just going to say it a lot of times before we get started right now, which is be sure that you have your chat set to panel. Yes, Esmeralda, exactly. To panelists and attendees, because this is one of the primary ways we interact, and we want everybody to be able to see what you have to say. So welcome to Navigating Grief and Loss. Today's focus is styles of grieving, and I am here with Dr. Judith Ehrman-Shapiro, who is I guess I'm calling her our Be Strong Families resident or guest expert on grief and grieving, because Dr. Judith she's done a lot of academic work on grief and trauma, and she's been with us since the beginning of the pandemic. Those are available. There were a number of presentations of webinars on grief at the very beginning, and then also on trauma and reframing trauma. And they're available because today and this week, she is not doing the academic approach. She's in her role as therapist and, what would you say, Judith?
Good listener and facilitator. That's it.
Good listener, facilitator, therapist with a lot of knowledge about grief. And so it's less academic. So if you want the academic stuff and a lot of information on grief, it's there. Just Andrew will put the link in the slide. And then we're asking you in the poll if you were here yesterday, just for curiosity's sake and to see how many repeats we have. So if you could answer the poll, that would be great. And then I'm going to do the housekeeping and then turn it over to Judith, which is ways to engage. The primary one is the text. Gladys, you can make up Monday's class, but you can't make it up in terms of certificate, but you can go online and listen to it. It's on our YouTube channel, and it's also Andrew has popped the recording in the chat. So the primary way to engage is the chat, and we really need you, please, even if you think you've checked, just check and make sure that you've clicked the second thing on the drop-down menu, which says panelists and attendees, or everyone. Juliana is asking, can I repeat find more information about grief? Andrew, can you put in the chat Judith's previous links to Judith's previous presentations? Can you do that for Juliana and everybody else? Cool, great. The second way to interact is, and we had a lot of people doing this yesterday, which was fabulous, is you can actually talk. We can't see you, but we can hear you. If you want to talk, you raise your hand, Andrew unmutes you, you unmute yourself, and then you'll be able to speak. So about 44% of the people who are here so far responding, we're not full up yet. We're here yesterday, and 56% were not. So we're about half and half. So those are the two ways to engage. You can raise your hand or you can write in the chat. And then the other bit of housekeeping that we always do is that when Be Strong Families recognizes that safe space is really important to go deep and to have quality conversation. So are you going to move to the next slide, Andrew? Thank you. So we always have agreements whenever we do anything in recognition that we co-create this safe space together. This isn't Judith's job. It's not my job. It's all of our job to kind of be here. And even though we're not in the room together physically, virtually your energy counts. The energy that you put in makes a difference. So we need you to speak from your own experience, treat other people the way you want to be treated, be here now and really focused on this. And if you need a minute, take a minute. Take care of yourself and take care of your children. If it just the conversation is triggering or becomes intense, you're just totally welcome to step away and come back. So if you agree to these agreements, please agree. Like we have Tammy and Lawan and Myra. And Andrew is putting in great, thank you, Katie. Bernadette, you got to do panelists and attendees. April, you got to do panelists and attendees. Stephanie, you got to do panelists and attendees. Gina, same thing. Janan, panelists and attendees. Okay, cool. I'm just saying that because I really want there to be full participation. And I'm going to repeat that if you make a comment and it's only to panelists, I'm not going to repeat it because I'm going to assume it's private. Okay. Thank you, everybody. And Judith, welcome. Thank you. Take it away.
So I thought that we would begin today the way we began yesterday. And indeed, maybe we should do this each day so we'll all get familiar with it. And I know, we're all in different locations, meeting virtually. So this is something you can choose to do or not to do, but it sure is nice in the middle of the day to just kind of sink down out of our heads and our emotions and everything go on and just be in the body for a few minutes. So we're going to do what I call the 6 movements of the spine. So this is really reconnecting through our central nervous system, 6 movements. You can do this seated with just your head. You can do it seated with your full body, which I'll show you, or you can do it standing. So I'm going to move my computer so that you can see me down here in this chair. And the first thing that we're going to do is fold over. We're going to do our forward fold, flexion of the spine. So just allowing your head to fall down towards your chest. And maybe this is good enough. Maybe you'll stay right here. But for those of you who would like to just slide your hands down your legs, allowing the weight of your spine and the weight of your head, the head is 15, 20 pounds, to just pull over, making a little more room in the back of your body and opening up your lower spine. And just when you get here, taking a nice deep breath and a sigh out or an exhale. And then connecting with the center of your body. Very often we'll say belly button to spine. We're going to start moving up the spine, sliding up the spine, rolling up the spine till you get to whatever is neutral for you, upright. And then we're going to continue going back. So we're going to just lean back, let your face look up to the ceiling or the sky, wherever you are. You know, if you're standing, I always suggest put your hands at your lower back and just lean into your hands. Let your body open up a little bit, open through your shoulders and your neck and your heart. And then with your next exhale, shortening the space between your ribs and the top of your hips and coming back to your neutral, whatever is upright and neutral for you. And then we're just going to roll the shoulders a little bit. Notice if you've brought any tension from the day. Notice if you're clutching in your jaw. And just see if there's any way to release, if that works for you, any of the tension in your body. So we'll do our rotation. And today we're going to do it like this. Lifting your fingertips towards me. We're going to move the fingertips off to your left or right side. Following your eyes, follow your fingers. Inhale here. And as you exhale, just allow the body to untwist. And then continuing to the other side. So just rotation of the spine. And we look with our eyes because the head is part of the spine, the neck. Exhale, bring yourself back to the center. So now with your hands just by your side, we're just going to go ahead and let the body sink to the right or the left, whatever's working for you. You can stay like this, or you can add the opposite arm. Oh boy, you want to keep anchored in that opposite hip so it doesn't pull you over. And it's okay to do it just like this. Inhale, growing up through the spine. Exhale and sinking over. So we're almost done. Just a little bit more. One more time to each side. Just like a little teeter-totter with your arm or without it. Opening up through your rib cage. You know, as you do this, you make more space to breathe. So we're just taking a moment to ground the body. So just sitting wherever you are, if you would like to close your eyes for just a set of breath or soften your gaze, of course, you can leave your eyes wide open if that's best for you. Nice deep breath in. Feel the air fill your lungs. And as you exhale, just feeling the weight of your body through the feet, through your hips, through the top of your legs. Thank you so much for doing that with me. Just a little grounding exercise to get going. All right, so yesterday we did no slides whatsoever, and today we have a slide or two. That's it. So what we have here is a lovely picture of a flower navigating grief and loss. Styles of grieving, our topic for today. And you can go ahead, Andrew, and move to the first slide. So what we're going to be talking about today was first written about in depth by Martin and Doka in a book called Men Don't Cry, Women Do, where the subtitle is Transcending Gender Stereotypes of Grief. And in their book, they did some research about, are our stereotypes actually correct that men and women grieve differently? Or is it more of a like folklore or common culture that lets us have these thoughts that men and women or people from any gender should grieve the same way? And what they found is that rather than there being stereotypes around lines of gender, they came up with these two groups called the instrumental grievers and the intuitive grievers. So the instrumental grievers, and someone yesterday was describing this so clearly. I'm not sure who it was. Dana, was it you? I don't know if you're here. But anyway, for the instrumental grievers, thinking is a much stronger response than feeling. So right away, we go into our thoughts, and we might not want to talk about our feelings. So there's kind of this folklore that everyone should cry, everyone should be talking about their feelings. But in fact, that just isn't true when you look at the evidence. People who are instrumental grievers, they want to master the environment and themselves. So they may be more apt to set up a memorial service, or do some writing, or go out and go running, rather than sit and talk about how they're feeling. So problem solving is actually a very important adaptive strategy for this group called the instrumental grievers. And so if you think about which gender, and I know I'm being very binary, but look, when this book was written in 2000, so please forgive me, but this style is often associated with men. But when they did the research, they found that it just wasn't true. Women are very often instrumental grievers rather than intuitive grievers. Intuitive grievers their feelings are just very strong. They have a very strong emotional sense, so that crying and talking about how they feel is their natural adaptive strategy. And these are expressions of their internal experience, which they're right away very connected to. Now, of course, this is associated with women, or it used to be associated with women, but when they did the research, they found, guess what? Just not true, not only associated with women. So men can be intuitive grievers, women can be instrumental grievers. And last point, and we're going to turn this off, the last point is that most of us are not one extreme or the other. Most of us are a blend of the two styles. But very often one may be a little more prominent than the other.
So Judith, I have a question. Does this, it was reminding me of like Myers-Briggs. It was reminding me of personality type, and people who are more thinkers than feelers, and vice versa. Does this track with that, or is there any research?
You know what? That is a fabulous question that I don't know the answer of for sure, but as you talk about it, I would say yes, because it's about what our natural preferences, like personality, rather than something we learn. It's what we really want to do.
And I have thank you. And I have a related question, which is, obviously there are biases in the common culture about grieving, and the intuitive grievers, to use your language, are thinking that the instrumental grievers just aren't in touch with their feelings, which is a bad thing. So can you speak to, and a lot of therapy is about, I guess it's a long way of asking the question, but a lot of therapy seems to be about getting people in touch with their feelings that may be more in touch with their thoughts than their feelings. So do people ever switch from being more instrumental to more intuitive, or more intuitive, to more instrumental?
Right. So it may not be, what you're saying is it may be state oriented instead of trait oriented. I think that's true. And I can't say this for sure, Kathy, but my suspicion is that different parts of your trajectory, so different parts of your pathway after your loss, you become more instrumental or more intuitive due to different circumstances and your personality. So a lot of us start out instrumental because we have children to take care of, we have parents to take care of, we have to settle estates, people are depending on us, we're instrumental because of what's required of us. But then 2 or 3 years down the line, we become very intuitive as grievers, because now those things circumstantially are settled. So I think you've really got, both points are excellent. And I also want to make a third point, which kind of goes back to Ahmed and your talks last week, which is that Western medicine, our culture's medicine, and psychology was built on a number of biases that have to do with expression. So in other words, sometimes I think, you know what, men couldn't win. No matter what they tried to do in terms of grief, you can't win, because they were being told, you know, you have to grieve in this way, unless they were intuitive grievers. See, watch my bias there. But the truth is that both instrumental and intuitive grievers, and I talked about this yesterday a little bit, are shown to have positive outcomes, meaning that in the end, we're able to grow, we're able to thrive. It's not based on whether you express your emotion or not. So it was a common bias in therapeutic situations, which really needed to be corrected by research. You know, when we really looked at how people grieve, we found out it's not true. People get very upset that they don't cry. And you know what? They don't have to cry.
Well, and one more thing that I think the most common thing that everybody has heard of when they hear of, you know, grief process is Kubler-Ross, and that there are these stages of grief that you go through. And so I don't remember exactly what the order is, but how does that relate to this conversation?
So that's an excellent point, is that as we go, we've learned more about it. But in the beginning, psychologists and psychiatrists thought that there were universal stages that we all went through. And it really set up a problem. It really pathologized a lot of people who didn't have anything wrong with them, because there are stages that are common to many of us, but they don't go in the same order or last as long. For instance, let's take the stage of denial. Some people have a very strong experience with denial after loss, and some people move through it very quickly and are very accepting, or never question, have just a great deal of faith and acceptance and experience with loss, and they don't even go through it. So the problem with this stage is that it was believed to be universal. So again, our system told people that there was something wrong with them if they didn't go through it in this order, in this way. And again, not true.
And I think the other thing, when you were talking about Ahmed and last week's decolonization for well-being, and their perspective, Ahmed's perspective on grief, is that there were indigenous ways of dealing with grief that got kind of eclipsed or co-opted in some cases and eclipsed in others, just kind of stamped out, that actually may be very helpful, you know, in terms of facilitating grief. I'm going to speak like in terms of traditional Jewish practice. You know, everybody does the same thing when somebody dies close to you, right? In traditional Jewish practice, there's like the way that you do it, and it's very prescribed. But in some ways, it also leaves a lot of room for whatever emotions, thoughts, feelings. It doesn't prescribe how you're supposed to feel when you're going through it, or what you do psychologically with your grief. It only prescribes what you do as a community. So, you know, how you rip your clothes when you hear of the death. You know, there's 24 hours you need to get the person in the ground. You know, you say Kaddish, you know, you have Shiva, which is people coming over to your house, and whether you like it or not, people coming over to your house and having the religious service there and eating with you. And the injunction on the people who come to your house is that they should take your lead and do whatever. Talk if you want to talk, don't talk if you don't want to talk. The griever, the bereaved, you know. And I'm saying that just because that's one system that I know about, and I'm sure every culture has specific ways of not curating, but of dealing with, and rituals around grief and grieving that may facilitate people's styles of grieving better than Western.
Absolutely. So that there's actually like a match or not a match. But you know what, Kathy, you just went way ahead of me, because we are going to talk about cultural prescription today. We're going to talk about that. But I want to start by asking the group this question. So thank you. That's a preview. But I want to go back to the idea of instrumental, intuitive. Am I doing tasks or am I being expressive? And where you are, and now I'm turning to the group, where you are in this. So here were my questions. What do you think of this framework? Does it fit your experience? And where do you see yourself in the framework? So I'm wondering if anyone wants to share or has thoughts as I was talking.
Yeah, put them in the chat or raise your hand to speak. And as usual, I'll fill space while people are thinking, because I'm sure usually there's a lag time between people writing and actually speaking. And I know yesterday we talked about like the multidimensionality of grief and how grief isn't the same in all circumstances. You know, like my father's death might be different than my brother-in-law's death, you know, based on my relationship to them and, you know, how much I have to do afterwards, all that kind of stuff. But I know that I'm a thinking person. I use my thinking to get to my feelings. You know, thinking was always safer for me when I was a child, you know, so I use thinking. So even with processing the loss of my dad, I was writing a poem for like the week that he was dying, which helped me understand what I was feeling, you know, like, so I don't know if that's instrumental or that's intuitive, but it wasn't like I was ignoring the feelings, but I was kind of processing them intellectually. So I think that maybe that's more So what we've got so far is Riette says, it's a relief to know that there's not one correct way.
Isn't it? It's so nice to know. I think so many of us are concerned with that when it comes to grief, that are we doing it the right way? Is it okay that we're experiencing it the way we are?
So Juliana has her hand raised. We're unmuting you. Juliana, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. So Judith, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process for example, in the same family, with the couple, when they experience a loss in the family, and each one are a different type of griever. So for example, last year we had a loss in our family, and it's just my husband and I, and I'm a super intuitive griever and my husband is completely instrumental. So it was a really difficult moment where I had the need of talk and express my internal feelings, and he didn't want to talk about it. He just wanted to do things. So could you talk a little bit about this balance and if there is anything that you would suggest or anything like that?
Oh, Juliana, thank you so much, because I think that we encounter that in families, and when it happens in couples, so that we're looking at like our primary person in a way, you know, our primary support, and they're really not getting what it is that we need to do at that moment. And even sometimes we tell each other, why are you keeping so busy doing that? I need you to sit and listen to me. Or it can be, you know, the opposite way around, that the person who really needs to be doing things is holding themselves around you to listen, but they really need to be off and doing things. I think like everything in a family, it's all about communication, compassion, and also knowing where we begin and where we end. Do you know what I mean by that, Juliana? It's like we get so enmeshed with members of our family. We do a lot of assuming, like we assume we know how they feel. We assume we know what they need. And there needs to be not only an honest conversation, but also just respect. So we need to enter the conversation with our loved ones with humility and with respect, but not with assuming. And this goes double, 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 double between parents and children, because children will look at parents if they're in denial of how that child needs to express themselves in loss, and they'll think there's something wrong with me. And they'll start judging themselves, and they may start burying their experience of loss and grief if they're not also treated with humility and treated with respect. So what I mean by that is humility means that we don't enter the situation knowing how the other person feels. We enter the situation knowing that that person is separate from us and needs the space to at least communicate about what their needs are. So that's humility, just not making the assumption. And then respect is that whatever we hear from that person, whatever we see them doing, we allow them to be sovereign. We allow them to be the king of their castle or the queen of their castle or the, whatever it is, the ruler of who they are. And we listen and maybe even ask the question, I don't really understand, but is there anything I can do to help? Is there anything I can do to assist you? And the other thing is that sometimes we can't just keep going back to one person to fill that need. We have to understand ourselves in community, so that if your husband was someone, and I'm being biased here, I'm so sorry, but who was instrumental and you were being intuitive, that maybe you understand that there are other people who can witness that part of you or be there with that part of you, and that the instrumental griever just can't do it right now. One thing, and then I'll stop talking because I want to know what people are sharing, but one thing that Martin and Doka, the people who wrote this book, point out is that even if I'm instrumental, I need to do things, I need to think, it doesn't mean I don't have emotional needs. In the same way, the other way around, even if I'm very, very intuitive, which I am, even if I'm very, very intuitive, I still have to think about things and accomplish them and do things. So all of us share that kind of collective need within us. It's just what's most important at that time.
Okay, I'm going to read the chat. And then I did have a thought before I do that, Judith, which is that thing you were talking about, getting our needs met. Like when we're raw and hurting and grappling in the grieving process, it may be natural to go to your primary person and want them to meet your needs. But how do you not judge them when they can't, when their grieving is different or when their personality is different? So I think that to me, sometimes I think like we put so much on our primary person that to meet our needs, and we get angry when they don't, or there's conflict when they don't.
And then that actually, and I don't know, Juliana, if you experience it, but it actually adds another layer of loss into what you experience, because there's a point of view that's disappointed that you can't be heard, not just heard, but understood. Yeah. But I do think that we are who we are, we are different than one another. It's part of why we like each other. It's part of why we need other people in our lives. And it's a real worthy, meaningful practice to have time to give, to have time to receive, to ask to be heard when it's really not happening. And then worse comes to worse. Well, not worse comes to worse, but also recognize there's a community around you.
Cool. So Bernadette, I think I'm a mix, but more an instrumental griever in general. I don't like talking about feelings. And Tammy says, I think I waver back and forth between the two. Some days I might want to talk through things. Other times I just want to be alone and keep busy. I wonder what the interplay is with personality type as an introvert or an extroverted introvert. Sometimes it's too draining to talk things through with other people. I also want to say that when I was listening to Intuitive and check myself, when I was listening to how you were describing describing intuitive, Judith, part of it was talking and listening, but part of it was just feeling, was crying, like intuitive grievers,
emotion.
Intuitive grievers may yell more. Intuitive grievers may be all over the map emotionally, or more expressive, or more in touch with their emotions about the process, as opposed to the instrumental, who are more in the thinking place.
Right.
Is that true?
Right.
It's not only about expression, listening, talking, right? Because I think, let me just ask the question, because I think, like, as an instrumental griever, I may want to talk things through with people. That doesn't make me an intuitive griever necessarily.
No, it doesn't.
If I say to somebody, what I want to talk to you about is different. What I want to talk to you about is, how do we get this thing scheduled, right? Or what do I do about the estate? So, okay. So my most prominent style, Janine says, is intuitive, but problem solving is also an important part of my grief process in the instance of death of a loved one. And Katie says, very interesting to see these different styles. I can see, depending on the stage of the process, in the moment versus down the line. I've been in both categories. And April says, I've been trying to get through the grief process from losing my dad 9 months ago and my mom 4 months ago. Oh, April, so sorry for your loss. A lot of us have lost people recently. My dad also about nine months ago. And both parents in that short space must have been very difficult. And Crystal Robinson says, it's been 4 months yesterday since the loss of my mom. I have days that I wanted people to check in and listen, and there are days that any words about my mom are so triggering they get into a funk that's hard to shake. So that's what we have in the chat. And
yeah, that goes back a little bit to what we were talking about, that oscillation. So we aren't one way. The way we are changes. I'm really glad you identified that certain days you have different needs. So it's, what does that go back to? Something that can be very hard, especially when we're hurting, which is communication. And also what we're going to talk about tomorrow, which is self-care. That it really, it's not up to anyone else how our grieving process is successful or not, or goes well. It's really this hugely internal process that we need to take responsibility for. And I mean that in a positive way, not but in a positive way. We can empower ourselves for saying, today I need to talk. I need to find someone to talk. And then, that afternoon, you're like, I know I asked you to call, but I really can't talk to you right now. So we give ourselves space to change, to need different things at different times. But it's all about this relationship we have with ourselves, really.
What a great point. And I'm looking forward to the self-care, because getting beyond just the superficial level of self-care. And Stephanie says that she lost both of her grandmothers and an uncle all within 3 years of each other.
Oh,
sorry about that, Stephanie.
So hard.
Most days I think I'm fine, and others I just want to sit in my car and cry and cry and cry. And some things are very triggering. I feel like it's also, I feel like it's also like sometimes I don't even know why I want to sit in my car and cry and cry and cry. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if that's part of a grief process too, is that sometimes it takes a little while to connect that I'm sad about this thing, rather than just to know where it's coming from. And Crystal says, yes, I'm learning that it's okay to not be okay. And Stephanie says, it feels like no one understands what you're going through, and it's made me a bit antisocial. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that you'll talk to us. I'm going to read these next couple things, but I'm hoping you'll talk about that, Judith, which is the whole thing of being a bit antisocial and not have people not understanding what you're going through. And how at the beginning, I guess this is the time, like the time limit on grief, if you could speak about that a little bit, because sometimes it's like that first week or the first 2 weeks or the first 3 weeks, like everybody's there. And then it's like they get tired of being there, they're on to other things. And there's almost like a pressure, like you should get over it. You should be over it by this time.
Worst thing to hear, isn't it? But
sometimes it's just their absence, like they just don't show up anymore, So, or they don't want to, or they don't invite conversation anymore,
Yeah, yeah. And actually, this goes with our next topic. I'm going to let you finish reading because it's more important, but which is social prescription, which is social conditioning, which is what it is we're supposed to do, whether we're instrumental or whether we're intuitive. But go ahead, finish what you're reading. And then
Okay, so Janan, I'm going to make an exception because Janan said did it to panelists, so nobody else can see it, but it says to everyone, so I'm going to read it. My most prominent style is kind of mixing. When I lost my husband, I feel I love to share with people with my thinking, even though they didn't give me any solution. But I feel like it bothered me if I kept it inside. And Stephanie says yes. And Tanya says, my father was diagnosed with cancer and passed 2 weeks after his diagnosis.
Oof.
Wow. Oh, Tanya, did you want me to read this to everybody? Because you didn't direct it to everyone. Okay. I wasn't even able to process his diagnosis, let alone the fact that he passed. I lost my cousin in January, my dad's sister in March. It's been a rough year. And the waves of grief have been a challenge on all levels. Totally feel that. We had one person at Be Strong Families that lost 16 people in their network, not all to COVID, but it was different things happening, but 16 people in like a short span. This last year has been really rough, really rough.
It has been really rough. And I'll tell you that there's two things in there. One is having multiple losses, which tend to build on one another in a short period of time. So that's one thing. The other thing is the sudden nature of loss. So, what we've learned is that, one of my areas of expertise is homicide and how we grieve after homicide. That's just an area. But one thing that I've learned is that it's not exactly the violent part of it, although it is, it's the sudden part of it. So 2 weeks after diagnosis is mind-boggling. I mean, how could you adjust to that idea, let alone the loss? What's amazing about human beings is how resilient we are, is how given enough time and space and compassion that we do tend to adapt. We adapt in many different ways. Part of the styles of grieving is that when we have ways of adapting that don't match our style, there's a conflict. And very often, again, this goes with self-care, we don't take care of ourselves the way we need to. For instance, say I'm an intuitive griever, I'm very emotional, but my main adaptive strategy is problem solving. So it may not help me very much, or doing things. So the ways you adapt, the things you do, the actions you take are actually very important. They need to match your needs. And again, this is a very internal conversation, about what is it I need and what is it I'm doing, and do they serve a function that will really help me in the end. One thing that I wanted to include in the conversation, and I think some people are kind of verging on this, is that when we talk about social prescription, it's what society tells us to do. And remember that there's society at large, but there's also our ethnicity may have a culture, and our religion may have a culture, and our family has a culture, right? And sometimes even the small group that we live with, our family of origin, or that we live with, has a culture. This is how we deal with this. And that prescription means these are the rules. So there's this unspoken, these are the rules, this is what you do. And part of that, Kathy, to answer your question, is how long you're allowed to grieve for. So how many times, I wonder, have you guys heard, I thought you'd be over this by now? Like, it's the worst thing in the world to hear. So let's talk about time for a minute, and we'll go back to social prescription. Within the first year of a loss, like maybe a single loss, I would expect there to be changes and changing emotions and difficult times as you encounter all of those firsts within your I'm having trouble hearing you. within your cyclical experience of the year.
Was that Siri?
It's Siri on something, but I turned everything off and I was like, who's speaking to me? Okay, Siri's talking. She wants to say something. Okay, so anyway, the first year, anytime within the first year, if someone says to me, I'm having a hard time, I say, oh, of course you are. It's your first spring. It's your first summer. It's your first Christmas. It's your first Easter. It's your first Hanukkah. It's your first birthday. It's their first birthday. So experiencing life without that person in the first year can be very difficult. And all of that is normal. And then aren't the holidays the worst? They're terrible. And then also say something special happens to you, like you graduate or you get married or you have some kind of important event in your life and the person isn't there. That can be 2 years from now or 3 years from now. You're going to notice that they're not there and you're going to grieve. There's going to be part of your mourning cycle that's in there. I would say a year or two, people don't worry. What they're doing now is psychiatrists, if it's within the first year of mourning, you're not supposed to give anyone a diagnosis of anything if you're mourning from something. So be very careful if you're like 4 months into your pattern, you're feeling really depressed, and someone tells you there's something wrong with you, you have some illness or sickness or pathology, because it's hard to tell. How can you tell if you're grieving for someone? The thing is, when it goes on for 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, I lost someone, Kathy knows this, I don't talk about it a lot, but I did lose someone to homicide. And my acute period of mourning was 4 years long.
And you still can get teared up about it, right? I mean,
it can still break me when I talk about it, but I also went on in my life and I got married and I had children and I feel like my life is purposeful. So I think that having someone say to you within a few weeks or even a few months, some of you said I'm 3 months out, I'm 4 months out. To me, that's very recent. It's a very recent loss.
So reading the chat, Tandra says, thank you for all of that, Judith. It's amazing. It's so much great and healing information and conversation. And I can just feel the pressure lifting, like from people being given permission to be how they are and to feel what they feel. And Tandra says, Ahmed had a good session a while back on boundaries and healthy communication. They talked about how to set your intentions and communicate what you need and how you need it to others. Some of us had never been taught that it was okay to take notice of our own needs and set and communicate those boundaries accordingly. And yes, I often find that what I need and what society wants me to need are two different things. And Stephanie says, yes, holidays are the worst and special events are triggers you don't even feel like celebrating. And Maria asks, who is Ahmed? Ahmed Abujaradeh is one of the architects of our grief deck, our grief compass, navigating trauma and loss. He's also a frequent, or they are also a, sorry about that. They are also a frequent presenter in our webinar series. And last week, they did a whole series on decolonization for well-being that included topics such as a lot, and Tandra was there, and a lot of it was about communication. There was an introduction that had a lot about communication. There's also conflict transformation, also accountability. And when we were talking about walking through accountability with other people, it was a lot of what Tandra was saying, that accountability isn't something that happens from outside, that we hold each other accountable, but it is about having conversation, that discussing when we get upset with each other and when what our needs are up front and how to do it. So yes. And Sheneva says holidays are the worst.
They are so hard. I want to say another thing, which is this. Our social conditioning, our social prescriptions are not all bad. So I want to make sure that I say this, that part of what's really helpful with social conditioning is it gives us some guidelines. Like a lot of people say to me, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to get through this. And rituals, ceremonies, all the things that are given to us through culture and through religion are really, really helpful. In fact, what they do nowadays is, if you haven't had any rituals or ceremonies that have been meaningful to you, they encourage you to create your own. I don't know if anyone's heard of that, but a ritual is a really important symbolic process where we get to move from one place to another place. And whether that's communicating with the deceased, or whether it's letting go a little bit, or whether it's being with ourselves and saying it's okay. You guys might think about like the balloons that people fly off into the sky or let go into the waves, are all very meaningful things that you can create a ritual if you haven't had one, or haven't had one that's been meaningful to you.
I love that, because yesterday also people were talking about how their faith community and their faith and their religion was very helpful in terms of being able to navigate and hold the grief and grieving process. And I've raised this before, but I always remember the meme that went around on Facebook a number of years ago now, I'm old, about Rwanda, and about the psychiatrist coming, or psychologist, Western psychologist coming into Rwanda after the massacre. And the people saying we had to ask them to leave because they took us into these little rooms and they asked us to talk about what happened. And and they didn't reaffirm any of the things that we know to do for these things, like drumming, like dancing, like being in nature. So it's like an example of a traditional society that knows how to deal with or deals with grief in a certain way, and trauma and loss, by connecting to the nature. And that when we came, we being Western, know-it-alls, we didn't respect that, So.
Right. And I wanted to actually show you guys another really cool book. It's called Grief and Mourning in CrossCultural Perspective, and it's an old book. It's like from the late 70s, but what they did, these researchers did, is they went into 78 different cultures around the world, 78, and they looked at grief and mourning. And what they found was that every culture has prescriptions and has rules, and also has attitudes towards, and this is what the researchers called deviant mourners, which just means those of us who don't fall into the goalposts, who are outside of what we're supposed to be doing. And that's where we get into a topic, and this was actually the last topic, and we have 10 minutes that I wanted to talk about today.
The book again. Maria's asking for the book.
Yes.
And Juliana saying this could be very helpful for immigrants and refugees who are living far from their families and can't attend funerals or be there the time of death of the loved one. And Maria says, once again, this goes back to knowing and respecting the culture of those who suffered the loss.
Very much so. This is Grief and Mourning in CrossCultural Perspective. I actually don't know how widespread, because it's from the 70s, it's available. But the point is that it
Andrew
really,
has to chat.
It really shines a light on how cultures are different. One culture, you're supposed to cry and wail. One culture, they were talking about the Andaman Islanders, who are actually sent off to be in isolation if you're in bereavement for a while. But then when they come back, they're welcomed with like this whole ceremony of weeping, like everyone weeps on command. I mean, cultures are so beautiful. They're so different from one another. But what happens when you're a deviant mourner like me, or maybe like you feel you are, is that we get into this area Kathy mentioned yesterday, which is, it's called disenfranchised grief. And disenfranchised grief, I'm wondering if anyone here feels that they've experienced this, is grief that is stigmatized. So, for instance, when I lost my loved one to homicide, I was an adolescent girl, and I was an adolescent girl who was not supposed to be in love. So people overlooked the pain that I was in, and they didn't even want to think I was in that relationship, let alone believe that I was in such bad pain at the time. But disenfranchised grief can go to people of different gender orientations, people who lose people through suicide or through homicide. People
forbidden relationships.
Children mourn terribly, and we think they're so flexible or that they don't understand, but they experience loss. So sometimes they're disenfranchised as well. Anyone have any comments?
Christy says she lost her 16-year-old son 3 weeks ago. Oh man, Christy. I have cried every day. These past 2 days, I have not shed one tear. I have a lump in my throat and I still hurt, but I feel like something is wrong with me because I'm not crying. I feel bad because I'm not crying. This is when we were talking, Christy. I mean, my initial thing is about oscillation. What I talked about yesterday was
your
about
body's cried all it could cry for a few days, and it needs a little break. Your central nervous system needs to stop and allow you time, to just take in what you've taken in, and maybe, your body has a certain wisdom. That's what they say. Maybe you need not to be crying for a little while. But the greatest thing that you can do for yourself right now is not position yourself as an enemy. You don't have to feel bad for that. You just lost someone so dear to yourself. Is there any way that you can just befriend yourself, just be in the same room with whatever happens for a little while? Because it is totally okay that you're not crying right now.
And Tammy says, Christy, thank you for trusting enough to share this sad news. My thoughts and prayers are with you and your family. Mm-hmm. And Christy says, thank you for that information. I've experienced that too, Christy, where the grief, and this was not the death of my child, but in a divorce situation, there were days when I was crying like 12 hours a day. It was one of the most painful things I've been through. And again, people don't, when I was going through it, I was like, I can't believe this is so common. I can't believe people do this, because it felt like a total, like, soul level, like, violence that I was going through. And I wanted the divorce. It wasn't like that I had been, like, cheated on and whatever, but I knew it had to happen. But sometimes it was so intense, the crying and the grieving for what wasn't going to happen. And sometimes I could make art about it, like I could draw. I used crayons, which are like oil pastels, and I didn't like try to make anything. I just, with color and smushing it with my fingers, around. And some days that was what I did, and then some days it wasn't a big deal, like it didn't overwhelm my whole day. Right. But I'm just saying, like, I feel like there's the grieving, and the grieving for a divorce that you've chosen might be also an example of the disenfranchised grief.
Yeah.
That you've chosen this. This is, it's already, some don't even sanction divorce. Thankfully in Jewish culture, you can divorce people. It's not, you don't promise to get married forever. So didn't have that extra overlay of breaking a promise or anything, but it did feel like, you got into this, you should have seen it coming. There's a lot of like shoulds that come from other people, and the degree of pain that it was causing me did not feel normal, or that there was very many places where I could express it and have it understood. So,
there's a similarity between the story you just told and what Christy said in those few precious sentences, which is that we judge ourselves so harshly I don't know why there's like an overlord in our brain that says you should be doing it this way, you should experience this way, instead of like being there and saying this is what is happening. But it happens. We judge ourselves really harshly. And the other thing I wanted to say to Christy is that sometimes when we have a moment to kind of feel a little bit less, we actually feel guilty about that because it takes away a piece of us that remained connected to that person. So on the good days, we feel as guilty as on the bad days when we feel terrible.
But that's interesting what you're just saying, Judith, because it's also about like the connection. Like right now, the connection is the crying, you know what I'm saying? And like there could be other ways of, you know, acknowledging that you remain connected, you know?
Right. Thank you, Taj. I don't know how to say your name, but thank you for telling that. We have 2 minutes left. Thank you all so much today for everything that you've offered to the group. You know, tomorrow we're going to be talking about self-care, and I'm hoping it's a conversation we generate together.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Judith. This was really deep and really beautiful. And thank you everybody for sharing as deeply and as honestly and openly as you did. A great conversation. Tomorrow, as Judith says, is grief and self-care. And then on Thursday, watching others grieve. And on Friday, there is a cafe, a Grief Compass Cafe, using our new book. Next week, we're starting some of our 30-minute ones. I'm going to hold space for a conversation on physical vitality and body-based grief, and like what happens in your body when you grieve. And then on Tuesday, Ale Salinas will be here, and he is one of the architects with Judith and Ahmed and Yoli and Sarita Sashington and Lori Sanchez of the Grief Compass, and Alexis Moreno, Navigating Trauma and Loss. This is a booster pack for our cafes, and just allowing you to have conversations like this in your communities with so if you haven't checked out our cafe resources, please do. And thank you everybody for coming again. Thank you, big thank you to you, Judith. Really appreciate you, and take care, everyone, until tomorrow.
Thank you so much.
Janine says this was wonderful and light and great session. We're getting some thank yous and great sessions, lots to think about, and also light. Like I love that. I find that true with the way that you hold the space, Judith, and the way you interact with questions. There's so much, it does feel like there's so much light and so much grace that you just embody. So